And after 5 years of commuting to Washington, D.C. from Tallahassee, Florida, where there are no direct flights to Washington, D.C., you get to go through Atlanta, I finally took the plunge. So I'm no longer a neighbor, but I do still work for you in Washington full time. I picked a really strange time to go to Washington, as you can imagine. It's a challenging climate, but there are very exciting developments and opportunities to make real reform in the way that we manage flood risk in this country, in part in response to the effects of a changing climate. Jumping right in, the things I'll cover very quickly, just sort of the current state of federal flood policy, the early lessons that are emerging from the experience of Hurricane Sandy, and then some of the federal policy changes that are underway. Folks that are familiar with ASFPM, we are 35 chapters strong, just welcomed our 35th chapter, more than 15,000 members across the country, 8,000 certified floodplain managers, and we swing a big bat in Washington and in many state legislatures. So we're out there working for you every day. The basic premise comes to us from Gilbert White. Back in 1945, his dissertation, Human Adjustment to Floods, teaches that floods themselves are an act of God. These are natural processes. These are beneficial and necessary processes. It only becomes a disaster when you put something you care about it in harm's way. So flood losses are largely an act of man. We also work from the premise that risk is a product of probability and consequences. You can work to affect both sides of this equation. We work largely on the consequences side, and a lot of the discussion around the law is on the consequences side. But we got to think about probabilities as well, and that's where things like flood control structures come into play. So, who manages flood risk anyway? It's not the federal government, I can tell you that, and I think in our federalist approach to land and development and property, our uniquely American relationship to the land, we recognize that there is a federal role, however, and that role is changing rapidly. We see this in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, where traditionally you see FEMA involved in the NFIP, Corps of Engineers involved in big water resource and related land projects, Bureau of Rec, of course, NOAA and USGS as important data providers. But things are changing. HUD is playing a much bigger role. DOT continues to, in many respects, lead the way, at least at the federal policy level. Now, how that translates to state DOTs varies widely state by state. We also see EPA playing a big role and recognizing the potential effects on major publicly owned treatment works and wastewater treatment plants, particularly in the Sandy context. Of course, Interior and Commerce both playing a big role, and increasingly DHHS. This is the Health and Human Services side. There are also big state roles that come into play with the involvement of state floodplain managers, state hazard mitigation officers, state land use and resource programs, emergency management, and then of course many states are cooperating technical partners under the FEMA mapping program. Florida is one of those states that has one of the most active and dynamic roles to play appropriately in the flood risk arena. And then obviously there is the local role. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where the decisions get made. You are the first and last line of defense between the folks who rely on you every day and the next big flood disaster, or not, just a flood, depending on how we handle things. And you're very familiar with many things that you are involved in. But I really want to emphasize the private sector role. There are 2 or 3 big takeaways from this afternoon. Here comes the first one. The era of federal largesse is over, in case you hadn't already figured it out. The era of big public money at any level of government is over. So we need to be reaching out to the private sector more and more, attracting private capital and investment, partnering with these employers who have every bit as much of a stake in a resilient workforce following a disaster as we have. For example, following Katrina, a lot of those bars and restaurants and music venues were actually undamaged and ready to get back rocking and rolling and producing the blues in New Orleans, and could not open their doors for months on end because their employees became the Katrina diaspora, spread out all over the Gulf Coast region and really all over the country. A resilient workforce matters to employers. So be thinking about that when you're considering how are we going to fund programs and projects. There is a role for the private sector. Obviously also in raising awareness, planning for business continuity and resilience, but also as a partner to contribute and participate. And we can't ever forget the personal role. This is one where we're still struggling. We see some resistance from individual property owners or families or small business leaders who every day are involved in making decisions about their risk. They need information, they need motivation and incentives, but they also need to, in some cases, adjust expectations about what government can do for them. For example, every family, every home should have a NOAA All Hazards radio. It should be as ubiquitous as a smoke detector. That's a very important personal responsibility that needs to be taken. Every home, every family should have a plan, every family should have a kit, and every family should be prepared to go it on their own for 72 hours or longer in the event of a major catastrophe. These are messages we need to be sending property owners, families, communities. Some of the early lessons that are emerging from Sandy, some of them are not new lessons. We already know that in many respects, federal policies and standards contribute to flood risk. The early adoption of the so-called 100-year or 1% annual chance flood as the standard for flood insurance in many respects became a de facto safety standard. So we have this bilateral, you're in, you gotta get flood insurance, oh no, or you're out, you're never gonna flood, you're not at risk, you don't ever have to worry about it. Whereas fully 30 to 40%, depending on how you measure it, of flood losses occur outside the special flood hazard area, and I can tell you the numbers out of Hurricane Sandy are much, much higher than that. So that 100-year standard really begs the question, is that appropriate? You'll see later on reports going back to the 70s answer that question with a resounding no, particularly in urban environments. Too much of a federal emphasis on structures and the ability to externalize the costs and decisions of state and local decisions across the country in this disaster relief environment that we find ourselves in, even right up to today. States and communities have for too long controlled land use more for short-term visions and not necessarily taken a longer-term approach. But then again, what incentives have they been given? Right now, local government, by and large, is incentivized. The NFIP provides the roadmap for how to build in your floodplains. And then the disaster supplementals that come down the road prove every single time that there will be a federal bailout. It won't be as big as if you were insured. Disaster relief is capped at $31,900. That's not going to make very many people whole. But then we have the case, and I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I stay in trouble. Toms River, New Jersey, big center of Sandy hurricane damage. Lots and lots of substantial damage. Repealed their ordinance in 2008. Nobody noticed. In March, they got their ordinance back on the books. And they're going to be treated exactly the same as the neighboring communities who enforced their ordinances over the last 5 years. I'm going to get in trouble for that. But somebody should. I don't mind calling them on it, considering what I've just seen this week in New Jersey. So we've got some work to do. Again, we have a public that is largely unaware of or resistant to the notion of the fact that they're at risk. And the misplaced concern is that they got to get flood insurance. You've all seen this in your daily work. Give me maps, give me maps. You give them maps and they're like, I don't want these maps are wrong. And the concern becomes, instead of I'm at risk and I didn't realize it, thank you for the heads up, it's FEMA, you put me in the floodplain. Local government, you're forcing me to be in this situation. And there's